We are now going to move on to our next session, which is moving sort of internationally. I mean, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about big global issues, and we're going to continue talking about global issues in this next session. We're talking international trade, migration, soft power, and diplomacy. And chairing this session is John Newbigin, OBE, who is chair of the Global Creative Economy Council. And he will be joined by Eliza Easton, who, of course, is Deputy Director of the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, Professor Giorgio Fazio, who is chair of Macroeconomics at Newcastle University, and someone I know very well, a very dear former colleague of mine, Rahana Magal, who is Director of the Creative Economy Global Programme at the British Council. So don't forget to put your questions on Slido, and please welcome them all to the stage. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Caroline, and welcome to this session. I've got three absolutely brilliant panelists, as you're about to discover. But before we do that, I should say I'm John, I'm a white man. I look as if I should be able to have a free bus pass, and I do. I have a suit which may be boring, but it's extremely well made. We're going to jump straight into this, and I'm going to turn first to the three panelists and ask them just to say briefly where they think we're at in a global context, and then we'll go on to talk about where we think we might try and get to. And Eliza, if I can start with you, you've been involved in the PEC since it began, so you've lived through the last 5 years of thinking about UK policy and how that fits in with things in the world. So where do you think we're at?
Thanks, John. I'm a white woman. I'm wearing a very, I'd say an extravagant purple cord dress, which I got for half off. Someone told me recently that British people can be told, can be recognised by always telling you if they had any of their clothes on sale. And I think that's right. And this was half off, so very pleased with that. So I'm pretty concerned about where we are when it comes to international policy and the creative industries. I'm not going to talk about how extraordinary our creative industries are, although if I was in a room of people who work on foreign policy, that's probably where I'd start. But I will say that we all know here that geopolitical context we exist within is becoming ever more complex. One of the reasons for that is very well highlighted by the last panel. So when we think about climate, actually so many of the climate impacts from the creative industries are bound up with the supply chains. So it's possible for a UK design company to basically be net zero, but actually designing stuff which is producing huge amounts of water pollution. But there are other reasons too. So for sure, things like changing dynamics with China. There's been a lot of news about that this week. There's also Brexit, of course, and the invasion of Ukraine. These things have all changed massively the context our creative industries exist within. However, policy has not changed, or where it has, there's often been a kind of withdrawing of policy supports for creative industries in terms of international working. So I'll just pick up on kind of three areas, and I'm sorry because these are my areas where if anyone gets me for a coffee, I kind of bore them on it. But the first one would be migration policy. So in the creative industries, between a quarter to a third of people are freelancers. In some areas like music, performing arts, that's around 70%. We don't have a freelance visa. That wasn't that noticeable when there was freedom of movement because, people from the EU at least could come in freely. But it's incredibly noticeable now because actually any of those sectors cannot get the people in because it doesn't matter if you're earning as much as any other sector. It doesn't matter if you're as talented, more talented. For the creative industries, for the arts, exceptional talent, or now it's called the Global Talent Visa, you basically have to have won a BAFTA. So we're talking totally different levels here just because of the way that our industries are naturally structured. So that pretty much needs sorting quickly. Bad state of play. Trade policy, I think when Lord Frost left his role as Brexit negotiator, I think he said something along the lines of I wish I could have done more on arts and culture. That's one area I regret. And I think we are often actually, in terms of our negotiations across the board, absolutely bottom of the pile. And that's because actually, as Giorgio may point out, lots of bits of the creative industries genuinely work differently to the rest of trade policy. So we're not always in free trade agreements. Culture is an exception, even in terms of the EU single market. And actually, it's just sort of forgotten about. But it shouldn't be. Of course it shouldn't be. It needs to be higher up the list. And then when it comes to diplomacy, I always quote Tom Fletcher, not the person who was in McFly, although I could quote him too, but the ambassador, the ex-ambassador to Lebanon, who was the international advisor to Blair and Brown and Cameron, and he says that basically it's whoever is in the role as ambassador, it's whether they're sort of interested in it or not. He says we leave our tools lying all over the ground. We have all these amazing things we can use to build international relationships, and we've just lost the ability to use them strategically. So, yeah, not great in terms of my summary, but I think unlike some of the other areas, people were super pessimistic in the poll at the beginning of the day that we could improve this area. Actually, I think there's some pretty clear steps we could take in this area. Some of the others are really knotty problems. With this, I think if there was enough incentive, we could sort this out. So maybe some good points to work from.
Thanks, Eliza. Giorgio, can I come to you next? And Giorgio's been involved in the PEC for a long time, but is going to be very closely involved in the PEC going forward. So, and you also bring an academic perspective to it.
I mostly bring an academic perspective,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So, thank you. My name is Giorgio. I am a white male. I wear a blue jacket, and my accent is funny because I'm Italian. And although I spent a long time in Scotland and in the northeast of England, I haven't yet picked up the accent. I'm sorry. So I hope that you can still understand me when I'm talking. So I'm currently I like to start on a more positive note than Eliza, I think. So when we started working on the PEC, I've been leading the work strand on internationalization. We knew very little about international trade, migration, and investment in the creative industries and the UK positioning. So that's where we really started. And I guess we can all agree that it's a success story. It is historically a success story. And people have mentioned soft power. I think it's something that it's difficult to measure, but we all feel that the UK has strong soft power internationally, and the creative industries have a big role in terms of soft power. Now, I'd like to take a step back and first address you from more an academic perspective. And the international trade economist in me will come out in a second. So when we look at international trade, and the title of this session is Trade, Migration, Investment, and Diplomacy, you're really looking at the four things that I will mention to my students in the first class of international trade. In economics, I'm an economist, we will call this general equilibrium. And I'm not trying to scare you, but it's simply the idea that you cannot look at each of these things separately, okay? So you cannot separate the exchange of goods and services from the exchange of people and the exchange of capital. And as much as we could think of the word trading and exchanging at terms that are decided by the market, diplomacy is clearly important, cultural proximity is really important, and decides a lot more the terms of trade than the market. So it's really important what kind of policies we decide and how we're going to trade with the rest of the world. Whether it's exchange of, as I said, of goods and services, but also capital, the policies that we have to attract international capital, or also to attract international capital, international talent, just like Eliza pointed out. Now, the UK is a success story because if you look at the trade of the creative industries trade, it is an increasing portion of the UK balance of payments. It is one of the leading countries across the globe, whether you're looking at services especially, but also goods. You have a lot of firms. By the way, I think Baz this morning mentioned that we may not have the full story because we are maybe not capturing everything in the official statistics. There's a lot of work to do with digitalization and trade in order to understand better how much we're actually missing. So it's not the entire story, but the UK is quite well positioned. Now, it is quite well positioned in a world that is, however, becoming increasingly competitive, because as probably will emerge later on, you have an emerging global south, and as Ekaterina mentioned earlier, you have increasing recognition of the UK, of the creative industries, creative and cultural industries in national industrial strategies, which means that we are competing against an emerging set of countries that have strong policy agendas, not just emerging countries, but of course also close neighbors. So I think that's important to recognize. trade is also related to investment, and the UK has been attracting a lot of foreign investment projects. With my colleagues at Newcastle University, we've done research in this area, and again, it is interesting that although most of this investment goes into the south and London, relative to the size of the economy, actually there are lots of projects also going outside the usual places, which is important to recognize. It is mostly through the form of mergers and acquisitions. So this is positive on one side, but can also be potentially problematic in signaling, in a way, the chronic absence of funding for the creative industries. So again, it is very much related to policies and access to funding domestically. And finally, there is the issue of people. I don't want to take too much of your time. There'll be time for questions later in terms of attracting international talent. So we, of course, just like it's a success story, there are also challenges. We know that Brexit and renegotiation of trade agreements is clearly one of the challenges. We know that small and medium enterprises have been massively affected by the cost of hiring creatives. We know that it's not just a matter of bringing laborers in, it's about bringing creativity in, which is a slightly different perspective, I think, when you look at the creative industries. And also, we have to remember that very often, when we look at the creative industries, businesses are people, and people are businesses. You have a lot of sole traders, freelancers, and micro businesses. So what Eliza mentioned earlier is particularly relevant. But I would also like to point to the importance of higher education institutions. And when we talk about higher education institutions, they serve two roles. What we find, at least in preliminary evidence, is that, for example, the existence of universities, their relationships with the creative sector is quite important in terms of attracting FDI into a particular area, especially outside of London. And also because they're more dispersed and they offer creative education across the regions and across the nations, they're able to attract international students from all over the world, fostering creativity also across the nation. So they have an important role in terms of leveling up. Now, of course, there are challenges there, because if we look at the impact of Brexit and tuition fees of students, that's one critical challenge. At the same time, it is fundamentally important to be able to boost the attraction of this talent internationally and keep going creative education, because it's a massive selling point for the UK in terms of soft power, but also in terms of experts, because these international students also represent experts in the balance of payments.
Giorgio, thank you. And finally, Rehana, who represents the British Council, which for me is the great unsung hero, certainly in the diplomacy and soft power department. And I can't resist saying, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was an event at the British Council with delegations from Iraq, Egypt, and Hong Kong. And I heard Rehana say, shall I talk in English, Arabic, or Mandarin? And I thought, my God, here's a woman who knows what she's talking about internationally. So, Rehana.
Thank you, John. So if there's any visually impaired people watching, I have dark, long, black, curly hair. I have brown skin, and I'm dressed all in black. And unfortunately, I paid full price for all of my clothes, which I bought in China because prior to being in the UK, which was quite recently, I've been in China for 3 years, during a global pandemic. So that was quite an interesting experience. And I must say, it's quite good to see Love Sega here. Because the British Council took Love Sega to Guangxi in China, and he participated in a Musicians in Residence program there. So he spent 2 months there in 2019, so please do talk to him in the break if you get the chance. I just want to go a little bit step back in terms of my, I guess if you say lived experience has come up earlier on a panel discussion. And I think it's important to think about that from the perspective that I'm having coming back into the UK after 9 years of being away. And what I'm seeing in terms of the UK now no longer in the EU. We're here today in the BFI, and what's really good is to see the amount of international content that we have access to here in the UK. What's also good about being in the UK is we've got over 300 languages spoken in this country. And on top of that, we have about 10 indigenous languages spoken in this country. So I would like us to celebrate that, because diversity really is the key to our creative edge in the United Kingdom. And as migration changes and as the movement of people changes, that diversity only gets richer. We've heard of lots of things around, for example, Equal opportunities with levelling up agenda has come up. So when we think about that and we think about the uniqueness of the UK's diversity and the ability that that gives us to have that intercultural fluency and openness to be able to operate in a sophisticated way with the rest of the world, that is unique to us. I believe that's unique to us, and that's something that we should celebrate, and that's something to be optimistic about. And I hope that over the coming years and months that this will only grow and get better, and that there will be more opportunities for that to happen. Linked to that, I think the opportunities around education, schools education, teachers education, higher education. When we think about our schools, when we think about our young people, how many of our young people have got an opportunity in the school curriculum to have access to international exchange, international knowledge? When I was at school, we did Romans, we did Egyptians. The world has changed. Young people are online. They are using digital technologies in ways that I could never have imagined when I was at school. So young people are connected, but how connected are they to parts of the world that they've never had anything to do with? And what lens do they connect through to those parts of the world? And I think that's where the creative industries can play a really key role. And what I think we need to do is to bring some of that creative edge that is very lively and vibrant in the global south and in developing nations, to bring some of that creative edge to the UK, to bring it into our schools, to give young people exposure to some of the talent that exists overseas. And that's what we do at the British Council. We navigate that complexity. We navigate that complexity, whether it's the development of policies to shape the future of the Iraqi creative economy, and hence they were in the UK recently. We're working very closely with Egyptian creative professionals to look at the creative economy there. We're also working, very recently, we're doing a piece of research on creative tech in Japan, in South Korea. We're also working for sector development, leadership and learning. So we're developing policy training. We've run policy training programs, and that policy training is evolving all the time based on the needs of the context of the country. That policy training is also in a variety of different languages. We've delivered that policy training in 13 countries, and just through the first cohort, we had 300 people registering for that policy training. It's through that sort of training that we can support the next generation of policymakers, of leaders, and of creative professionals to think about some of the issues that have already come up this morning on several panels. The panel before this one was very focused on climate, for example. So in our policy training, we have a whole section on climate and what that might mean in the context of the country where that training is being delivered. So those are some of the key points I wanted to mention. I want to also bring us back to the pandemic and during that time of closure. The British Council, which is a very large organisation that has been operating for over 80 years in over 100 countries, did the mammoth task of developing new funding schemes at pace. So we developed a digital collaboration fund, and this enabled people in the UK to be able to connect with people overseas digitally. We also delivered the International Collaboration Fund and a Digital Connections Through Culture Fund. Connections Through Culture is the fund that Love Sager was involved in when he went to China. And on top of that, we also delivered a Creative Commissions for Climate Action Scheme, which explored climate change through art, science and digital technology. Those are just some of the ones I can think of, but there were many more. And we did this because borders were closed, people could not travel. And we did this to ensure that that pathway to international connection remained open, because it's crucial that we in the UK have a connection to international creative professionals at a time when actually the whole world was vulnerable. And what the rest of the world was going through, we were going through. But it was just a different context that we were in. Our situation was just different. At that time, I was in China, where the borders were completely closed. It was a very different sort of lockdown. But during that time, creative professionals, filmmakers, artists, designers had the opportunity to develop a sense of understanding, but also empathy with people of another culture. And I think if we, as Britain, are going to move forward in the creative industries, this is our route. It's our diversity, our intercultural fluency. We are a creative nation, and I think we're a vibrant nation.
Rihanna, thank you. And look, just before we go on to talk about where we think things are going to go next, I'd just like to add a couple of things. One is, I think that we still tend to think, or we easily think of the creative economy as being Europe and North America. But what was happening before the pandemic was the growth in South-South trade in cultural goods and services was growing massively. That is absolutely accelerating now, particularly in Africa, where it's starting from a lower base, but it is exponential what's going on. I was really struck that The Economist had a couple of good pieces about the Nigerian election a few weeks ago. And one of them said there are 3 sectors in Nigeria that are really doing well: film, fashion, and music. All of them totally informal, nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with official corruption. There's Nigeria, most populous country in Africa, the wealthiest country in Africa. The bits that are working are not the oil industry, but the creative industries. That's happening all over Africa. And I think it's to reference something that Ekaterina said, and Giorgio, you picked up, the G20 for the last 3 years, in its final statement, has emphasized that culture and creativity are crucial to generate a sustainable, inclusive, post-pandemic global economy. And in the global south, interestingly, I think it's climate change and inclusivity that are seen as the key drivers of the creative economy. Hassan, the first thing this morning, mentioned the 2 areas that the PEC's got to get stuck into because we're not paying enough attention to it: climate change and inclusivity. If you go to South Asia, East Asia, that's what they focus on. It's no accident that the UN Year of the Creative Economy's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals came out of Indonesia. It was lobbied for by Indonesia and by African, Asian, and Latin American countries. It's hugely significant. And I think the danger is that if our creative economy begins to diverge from that, then we're all going to be losers. So bringing what we're doing in the North back in tune with what's happening in the global South, because that's where there's so much energy, I think is really important. And a couple of other things, very briefly. One is that under autocratic regimes, which unfortunately seem to be on the rise around the world, creative economy provides a kind of cover to talk about culture, about women's rights, about women's employment, even about LGBT rights, in a way that culture is much too toxic and dangerous. We were at a conference in Istanbul in November for representatives all across Central Asia, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and so on. And one of the senior functionaries from the Ukrainian Culture Ministry said, you cannot have a creative society if it's not an open society. All these people from Central Asia clapped. That would not have happened 5 years ago. And they see this as something which is contentious and potentially really significant. There's a soft power dimension to the creative economy, which I think we fail to recognize in this country. That is an incredibly powerful card to play, not just for the benefit of our country, but in terms of spreading values that I think most of us believe in all around the world. The creative economy is an incredibly powerful sort of Trojan horse. I see you want to get in already, Eliza.
I just on that, I don't know if people in the audience read, there was an article which I must have been sent by every person I've lobbied at Number 10 and lobbied, not allowed to lobby. I've influenced using our evidence over the last 5 years. And it basically said soft power's out, hard power's in. When you're thinking about the rise of these new hard powers, who cares about soft power? And it drove me absolutely mad, because that's such a misunderstanding of the global dynamics we're talking about. And I think that our event, which we were all involved in different ways in Istanbul, really stood testament to that, which is when you look at Russia-Ukraine, of course the Ukrainians are talking about hard power, but they're talking about soft power as much. Those 2 things go hand in hand. And how can we find lasting peace without cultural understanding of one another? If you look at the difference between, it's a very blunt statistic to use, but BBC World Service, the people listening to the BBC World Service at the end of the USSR, I think it was over half of people had listened to the BBC World Service in the USSR in that last year. if you look at that in much more recent conflicts, almost no one was having those conversations. Actually, the understanding of the two sides with each other in many recent conflicts weren't there at all. And so, to me, lasting peace is going to be almost impossible to achieve. And I find it so frustrating that people think that you can have any effective hard power without soft power. And I think, if you spoke to the Ukrainians, and we did, someone from the Ukrainian government came and spoke, and as she was, making all of us cry with stories of bombs put in pianos, I think it's absolutely essential to say that people on the ground in war zones are also talking about the importance of culture, the importance of the arts.
Absolutely. I'm going to be a Stalinist chair because we were told to be Stalinist chairs because of time. I'm going to say one other thing very briefly. It seems to me the two real powers that we have in this country in terms of influencing policy in the creative economy around the world have been the British Council, I do think unsung hero, but the other thing, has, Nesta gave birth to the PEC, and I have to say, I think it is utterly scandalous and disgraceful that Nesta has decided to walk away from creative economy because, the clue is in the name, science, technology, and arts, where they come together. The great thing is the AHRC and UKRI, by picking up the PEC and giving it a forward-facing future, which is also going to be international, I think is incredibly important. And these two institutions, aside from what happens in the industry, so to speak, in terms of policy and influence, these two institutions, the British Council and the New Look PEC, if I can put it like that, I think are going to be hugely influential. So let's go on to talk about where other people think things are going to get to in the next 5 years. Giorgio, I'm going to come to you first because you're going to be intimately involved in the PEC over the next 5 years.
Of course.
So tell us what's going to happen.
In the PEC, or in general in the global economy?
Well, in the global, the PEC's influence in the global
And the global economy.
What's the UK's? How is the future evolution of the creative economy going to impact on the UK, and how can we impact on it? That's my question.
So that's a great question. Do we have half an hour?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So I think so that we have touched upon many issues. I think there are important developments happening globally and are worth having a look at. So first of all, we are coming out of a pandemic, and that's not something trivial. What has happened as a result of this is there's been partly movement in terms of international trade that we will call reshoring. And that has prompted a movement of deglobalization. So that's what at the moment people are talking a lot about in terms of international economics circles. Now, together with this, you've had the war in Ukraine. And deglobalization is also becoming political. You're starting to have, again, the emergence of blocs. Now, we mentioned the role of culture a lot. And I have to say that culture can clearly broker peace. It's extremely important in brokering peace. If you look at trade agreements, many trade agreements will start in the preamble mentioning cultural cooperation somewhere. There will be different strengths depending on the agreement about the importance of culture. So it's a bit of of something that we need to still understand how much it actually matters to have cultural cooperation mentioned in the agreement and in the preamble. And sometimes culture is actually exempted, or it is an exception in the trade agreement. So it's clearly something that is very politically charged, both when you want to broker peace, sometimes when you want to do the opposite, because we see now culture becoming, there's almost a call to war when there are the sanctions, right? Sometimes you go and you sanction the cultural economy. Sometimes you don't sanction the cultural economy. You don't want directly sanction the cultural economy. And you end up having culture as collateral damage. So I think we live in a world where we are looking at deglobalization. Before the pandemic, we were looking at the emergence of the global south, so becoming increasingly global. We are seeing at culture becoming a political tool or a diplomatic tool, which can serve in both ways. I think there is a bit of a risk as well as being a tool to broker relationships. It can be also a bit of a risk when, just like you said earlier, when it becomes a monopoly of politicians, okay, or certain parts of society. I think there is also risk in that, and that's the context where we'll need to navigate. And I think if I look back, Rihanna mentioned something that's important, and also you did. Historically, the UK has been a very open society. Historically, I mean, like centuries, right? So you mentioned autocratic regimes, and for centuries, the UK has been the host of creatives and free thinkers from all over Europe. And I think there is still a scope for the UK to do that because it is an open society, and it is really what really matters in order to have creativity and foster creative clusters. In terms of what I think the PAC can do, I think Ekaterina mentioned it this morning. So the PAC is one of its kind internationally, and when around the globe people started thinking about policies for the creative industries, they looked at the UK definitions, the work done by Nesta. So in a way, it's about continuing doing that in a context where you now have a lot more talk about the creative economy around the globe, creative cultural policies around the globe, in a far more controversial setting generated by deglobalization and blocks. But I think we have an opportunity here with the PAC and the PAC work, and with the help also of the Global Economic Council and the British Council, to still broker relationships, keep the conversation going, and influence the debate on the creative industries internationally. So that's what I'm looking forward to in the next 5 years.
Giorgio, thank you. I mean, according to this, we're out of time already, but I think I'm going to regard that as disinformation for a minute. Rihanna, you got 2 minutes. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Okay, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. I think, well, what we're seeing is a real interest internationally in terms of the creative economy growing everywhere. If you look at the report from UNCTAD in 2020 in relation to what happened after the pandemic, 10 million jobs were lost and 750 billion in the creative and cultural goods and services. But what we are now seeing is a real appetite internationally to want to collaborate and connect with the UK, and I think that we should open our doors for that, obviously. Somebody mentioned earlier showcasing, the word came up, and I think it's important to think about our offer as the UK, and somebody also used the word humble Britain. For me, showcasing is actually, collaboration is a form of showcasing. Collaboration gives us the opportunity to have a dialogue. Collaboration gives us the opportunity to share our values and learn about the values of others in different contexts. So I hope, and I'm hopeful, that there will be more collaboration happening internationally, and that more of the UK, the whole of the UK, the Union, will have the opportunity to work equally in new territories and new parts of the world. I also think that there should be more opportunities for young people to be connected internationally. I think the UK needs to be connected nationally and internationally, particularly our young people, and there needs to be more opportunities in terms of skills.
Thank you. And Eliza, I'm going to come to you, but before I do that, I'm going to read it. We're going to have one question, super quick answers, but I think it's an important one. So just for you other two to bear in mind how you're going to answer the question before we come to Eliza. And the question is, how has the hostile environment for immigrants affected the desire of people to come and work in this sector in the UK, and how can that be changed? Eliza.
Yes, so we have seen that what could be described as a hostile environment has had an impact, and I think that the piece of research that I'm kind of thinking about the most is actually a piece which looks at it in the context of uncertainty. So especially when people didn't even know what would happen to them, that in itself is a kind of hostile environment, I'd say. So people being like, I don't know if there's going to be a policy in place that will allow me to move or to be able to live somewhere. To give one very sort of specific example that I find myself giving often to government, and again, this is the bit that I know the most about. I'm sure there are all kinds of other aspects of a hostile environment that I'm not touching on, but if you're thinking about, say, a designer, so designers, 1 in 2 people are freelance, who wants to come over, they are impacted by Brexit uncertainty, they're wondering what the actual atmosphere is like in the UK, how much has changed, but also very practically, even if they have a paid job in a creative design agency lined up, if they, at some point, which almost inevitably they will, want to work freelance for a bit, which is the norm, they have no certainty there. And that uncertainty might actually hold someone back, despite, in their case, there being a very clear route. And so, yeah, it's not quite the same as the kind of hostile environment that people are feeling across the board. But just to give a specific example of how uncertainty impacts people, I'd point to that.
And just before, you didn't get a chance to say what you think is going to happen over the next 5 years. Optimism, pessimism.
Okay, so
What do you think is the UK's role?
I think that the UK has a really significant role. I think that we need to, policymakers need to wake up a bit across all three of the areas of policy I spoke about. So I think that means thinking about foreign policy. I think that means absolutely prioritising an understanding of culture and creative industries in our diplomatic work. I think that means radically changing the migration system, dealing with things like hostile environments. I think it also means changing the trade legislation. But I'm optimistic. I think it's all possible.
So on the question, I think that it is a real problem. As a EU national going through Brexit, I think, of course, I've experienced this firsthand. But I also think that over time, this is something that will be resolved. So it has a lot to do with uncertainty, because the core values of British society are those that I was mentioning earlier: openness, inclusivity, a lot more than other places. So in the long run, I think these values will prevail also in terms of the way we are seen across the globe. And I think that's important. I would maybe, in terms of policy, look at higher education institutions, places of education. It could be schools, like Diana mentioned, and higher education institutions who are truly global, and they can really help in terms of conveying the message of openness. And we should be definitely more careful in terms of looking at credit degrees and programs and the way they're funded and the way they attract international students, because they are a path to also upskill locals. Definitely. There's a lot of complementarity.
Rahana, 30
Just very
seconds.
quickly, I think Eliza covered most of the points, but just this week I met a colleague at the British Council who was blind from birth and studied in the UK and is on a graduate track visa. And she's from Sudan, and you're following the news about Sudan at the moment. Her family is safe, but she's in our organisation, and she's working with us. So there is a graduate track visa that is able to bring people into the UK to study, but they can also stay on and contribute. At the British Council, we also run a global alumni programme, and that means that we connect with young people who studied in the UK and then went back to their country of origin. And when they are back in their country, we are able to then reconnect with them, because they have, obviously, memories of being in the UK, of the gigs that they went to, of the places they used to hang out. So we're offering opportunities to, through culture, for them to reconnect with the UK and to remain champions of their experience of the UK.
Thank you. Fantastic panel. Thank you.